I arrived at the wedding dressed in my best suit. Not ostentatious, but well-fitted, respectable. Or so I thought. The moment I stepped inside, the air itself seemed to shift. Conversations faltered for a split second, replaced by hushed whispers. I could feel their stares slithering over me like unseen hands, peeling away any dignity I had left. My wife's family had never truly accepted me, but today they didn't even bother to hide it. The venue was a cathedral of excess. Ivory silk, drapes cascaded from the ceiling. Chandeliers glittered like constellations, and floral arrangements sprawled across the hall in unnecessary grandeur. Every inch of the space screamed wealth, but every glance in my direction whispered something else. You don't belong here. I made my way toward my wife, but before I could reach her, her mother appeared. Regina Vasquez, the family's iron-fisted matriarch. She was more than just my mother-in-law. She was the self-appointed guardian of their aristocratic lineage, and to her, I was an ugly ink blot on their perfect family portrait. Her lips curled into a practiced, saccharine smile, so sweet it could rot teeth. Oh, Julian, you actually made it. The feigned surprise dripped from her voice like venom disguised as honey. I forced a polite smile. Of course. Wouldn't miss it for the world. She gave me a slow, deliberate once-over, scanning me like a jeweler inspecting a counterfeit diamond. Then, as if I were a trivial afterthought, she gestured toward the very last row of chairs, seats meant for distant relatives, the ones who show up uninvited but are tolerated for the sake of appearances. Why don't you sit over there? She said, her voice laced with mock concern. We wouldn't want to ruin the wedding photos now, would we? The words cut deeper than I expected. Not because they were unexpected. No, I had endured years of subtle and not so subtle insults from this family, but because of how deliberately cruel they were. A direct public dismissal. I turned to my wife, Valeria, searching for something, a defense, an objection, even a simple look of discomfort. Instead, she let out a soft, amused chuckle and shook her head. Mom, be nice, she said, her voice light, dismissive. It wasn't a defense. It was a pat on the head, a signal to drop it, to accept my place. For years I had swallowed my pride, allowed them to belittle me, tolerated the sneers and the whispered remarks. I wasn't born into wealth. I didn't have a last name that opened doors to boardrooms and country clubs. I had built myself from nothing, brick by back-breaking brick, but to them that was a flaw, not a triumph. I clenched my jaw and did what was expected of me. I walked to the back, sat where they wanted me to, watched as the real family took center stage. The wedding unfolded like a scene from a high-budget film. Champagne toasts, laughter that sounded just a little too perfect, flashes of cameras capturing a moment of prestige. My brother-in-law, Diego, beamed as he twirled his bride on the dance floor. Photographers scurried to immortalize every angle of their flawless union, and I sat there, watching. Valeria had once told me she loved me for my ambition, for my determination. She used to whisper that money didn't matter, that we were equals, partners in everything. But as time passed, I saw the shift, the way she basked in the comfort of being the one who married down, the way she let her family treat me like an inconvenience instead of her husband. And tonight? Tonight she didn't just allow it, she laughed, and something inside me snapped. I reached into my pocket, feeling the smooth surface of my phone. Then, without a word, I stood up and walked outside. They didn't notice. Not yet, but soon they would, and they would never forget this night. The moment I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit me, stripping away the suffocating weight of the room. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the distant hum of a violin seeped through the grand doors behind me. But out here, beneath the darkening sky, it all felt distant, insignificant. I exhaled slowly, my breath steady despite the anger curling in my chest. I had endured years of silent humiliation, suffered through their cutting remarks, their thinly veiled mockery, and tonight they had pushed too far. They thought I was powerless. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact labeled under a single word. Execute. I pressed call. A deep voice answered on the first ring. Is it time? A slow smirk curled at the corner of my lips. It's time. There was a low chuckle on the other end, a man who enjoyed his work. Understood. Give me 10 minutes. I ended the call without another word. No explanations were necessary. We had prepared for this moment months ago. My wife's family had always assumed I was struggling. They saw my simple, strategic lifestyle, my lack of designer suits, my preference for subtlety over excess, and mistook it for weakness. They never asked what I did for a living, never questioned where my wealth came from, never thought to wonder how deep my connections ran, and that was their second mistake. Because while they spent their lives flaunting old money and family legacies, I had built something far more powerful: influence. And in exactly 10 minutes, that influence was about to tear their perfect little event apart. I took my time walking back inside, unhurried, calm. Inside the grand hall, nothing had changed. The wedding continued uninterrupted. The guests, draped in silk and diamonds, chatted over delicate plates of hors d'oeuvres. Diego twirled his bride beneath the golden glow of chandeliers. Photographers captured every stage smile, every carefully curated moment of perfection. They had no idea what was coming. I slipped back into my designated seat at the far end of the hall, the symbolic reminder of where they thought I belonged. Sat, waited, and then like clockwork the first sign appeared. It was subtle. Too subtle for them to notice, but I saw it. The head chef, a man in a pristine white uniform, whispered something to a nearby waiter, then casually removed his apron and walked away. A second waiter followed, then another, and another. The guests didn't notice. Not yet. The music still played, glasses still clinked, laughter still rang through the air. But behind the scenes, the foundation was beginning to crack. The staff was vanishing, one by one. A bartender quietly untied his apron and slipped through the back doors. A decorator abandoned a half-finished floral arrangement and disappeared into the night. The kitchen staff, the very people responsible for ensuring that trays of golden-crusted hors d'oeuvres and glasses of Dom Perignon never stopped flowing, were walking out without a word. The guests were blissfully unaware, but not for long. I leaned back in my chair, fingers lightly tapping the armrest. My wife, Valeria, was still engrossed in conversation with her sister and a few high society wives, sipping champagne, laughing, so comfortable in my silence, so sure that I would simply accept my place. And that was her third mistake. As the 10-minute mark approached, I adjusted my cufflinks and checked my watch. The countdown had begun. I lifted my glass, swirling the amber liquid inside, and took a slow sip. Enjoy this moment while you can, dear. In-laws, you won't like what happens next. At first, the change was nearly imperceptible. A missing tray of appetizers, an empty glass waiting too long to be refilled. The guests continued their mindless chatter, oblivious to the subtle unraveling of their perfect evening. But then, the cracks deepened. A woman in a midnight blue gown, a close friend of my mother-in-law, snapped her fingers impatiently at a passing waiter. "Excuse me, we haven't been served in a while." The waiter, a young man with darting eyes, hesitated. Then, without a word, he placed his serving tray on an empty table, pulled off his name tag, and walked out. The woman frowned, muttering to her companions, but quickly returned to her idle gossip. Still unaware, at the bar, an older businessman in a tailored tuxedo leaned against the counter, his glass tilted expectantly. "Another whiskey," he ordered, knocking his knuckles against the wood for emphasis. The bartender, a middle-aged man, with steady hands, didn't move. He stared at the counter for a moment, exhaled, then, without a word, untied his apron, tossed it onto the bar, and walked away. The guest blinked. "What the hell? Where are you going?" No answer. Other guests started noticing the irregularities. The once seamless service was faltering. Plates remained uncleared. Wine glasses sat empty. Servers who had been gracefully weaving through the crowd just moments ago had vanished without a trace. Confusion rippled through the ballroom. Near the head table, a group of elegantly dressed women waved down a passing waiter. "Another bottle of champagne, please," one of them requested, lifting her empty flute. The waiter nodded and disappeared into the back. They waited. 5 minutes. Past 10. The waiter never returned. "Where did he go?" one of the women murmured, twisting in her seat. The murmur spread like an infection. A low hum of confusion building. Guests shifting in their chairs, craning their necks in search of missing staff. The final thread snapped when the music stopped. The grand piano fell silent. The violinist tucked her bow under her arm. The drummer adjusted his cufflinks, stood, and, without a single word, walked off stage. The silence was deafening. The absence of music, so unnoticed in its presence, now loomed over the ballroom like an omen. And that was when the panic began. At the front of the hall, my mother-in-law, the self-proclaimed queen of decorum and status, finally took notice. She had been too busy parading her wealth, collecting compliments like trophies. But now something was wrong. She snapped her fingers at the wedding coordinator, a frazzled woman in a black suit and headset. "Why is the music off?" she demanded. "Where's the champagne service? My guests are waiting." The coordinator, usually the epitome of professionalism, looked visibly shaken. I'll check on it." She turned on her heel and rushed toward the back, but there was nothing to check, because there was no staff left to check on. At our table, Valeria finally peeled herself away from her conversation, frowning. She turned to her sister. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice laced with mild annoyance. Her sister shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, but I saw some of the staff leaving. I think something's happening." Valeria's frown deepened. She turned, and for the first time all night her gaze landed on me. I was already watching her. I lifted my glass slightly, my expression calm, controlled, and in that instant, I saw it. Recognition. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but she knew. She knew I was behind this. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. She looked around the room again, this time with urgency. Then, for the first time all evening, she looked worried. Good. Because this was only the beginning. A silence settled over the ballroom, not the comfortable kind. No, this was the kind that made people shift in their seats, clear their throats, glance around for reassurance that everything was still under control. But it wasn't, and soon, everyone would know it. I remained seated, at the back, arms folded, watching the slow realization creep through the wedding like a rising tide. At first, the guests tried to ignore it. These were people who thrived on maintaining appearances, who would rather choke on their own pride than admit that something was wrong. But then, at the far end of the hall, near the kitchen doors, 3 waiters exchanged glances, and as if on cue, they removed their aprons, tossed them onto the nearest table and walked out. A groomsman, broad-shouldered, clad in an overpriced tuxedo, furrowed his brow. "Hey, where are you guys going?" No response. He turned to grab another waiter, but that one was already walking away too. Then another. Then another. The graceful, choreographed movement of the staff was crumbling like a house of cards. Across the room, at the bar, the head bartender lifted his hat, tipped it slightly toward my mother-in-law, and walked out. Behind him, the 2 junior bartenders hesitated for only a moment, then followed. The line of guests waiting for drinks stared at the abandoned bottles, the empty bar stools. Someone chuckled nervously. "This must be a joke, right?" But nobody laughed, because the second wave had already begun. The first real sign of panic came when my mother-in-law finally lost her composure. She had always been a woman of control, of power, of ensuring that everything went exactly the way she wanted it. But right now, her control was slipping through her fingers like sand. Her lips tightened into a thin line. She whipped around looking for the wedding coordinator, her last line of defense. She found her standing near the stage, frozen, staring, not reaching for her headset, not rushing to call for backup, just standing there, because she already knew there was nothing left to fix. Fix this, now. My mother-in-law's voice was sharp, cutting through the murmuring guests. The wedding coordinator swallowed hard, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. Ma'am, she stammered. "The staff, they're gone." My mother-in-law's eyes bulged. "Gone," she hissed. A slow, dawning horror spread across her face as she scanned the room. The empty serving stations, the abandoned bar, the vacant stage where the band should have been. Gone. Every single one of them. I saw it happen in real time. The moment the realization struck her like a brick to the face. The wedding. The one she had spent over a year planning. The one she had used to flaunt her social status. The one where she had mocked me, belittled me, pushed me to the back like an uninvited guest. It was unraveling right in front of her, and she had no clue why. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, frowning, whispering in confusion. Why is the service stopping? Where are the waiters? This is weird. Who runs out of staff in the middle of a wedding? The guests who had been holding empty glasses too long started looking irritated. The ones who had half-eaten plates of food realized that no one was coming to clear them. The ones who had been waiting for fresh rounds of champagne were now holding nothing but thin air. A woman in an emerald green gown, her diamond necklace glittering under the dim lights, waved down a passing staff member. "Excuse me, could you tell me what's going on? We've been waiting for service." The staff member, a decorator, one of the few who hadn't left yet, simply smiled. Then he took off his name tag, placed it neatly on the table, and walked away. The woman's jaw dropped. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were loud, nervous, frustrated. And then, the lights dimmed, not in a romantic ambient way. No. The sound system crackled, the chandeliers flickered, and suddenly, all the decorative spotlights, the ones highlighting the bride and groom, they shut off, the ball, and was already gone. The music wasn't coming back. Now the entire event looked dull, lacking, lifeless, without the perfect lighting, without the trained staff running the show behind the scenes. It was no longer an extravagant wedding. It was just a badly planned event falling apart. And that's when the first wave of exits began. Guests who had only come for status reasons, who had no real connection to the bride or groom, took this as their cue to leave. I watched, completely still, as people started slipping toward the exits, not running, not making a scene, just quietly walking out, as if they didn't want to be associated with a failing event, as if they didn't want to be seen at a wedding that was, in real time, becoming a disaster. By now, Valeria was pale, her perfectly manicured nails tapped anxiously against the table. She scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone to take control. Her mother, furious and yelling at the coordinator. The venue manager, nowhere to be found. The waiters, gone. Then she turned and locked eyes with me, and this time, there was no mistaking it. She knew. She didn't know how I did it. She didn't know when. I did it, but she knew. It was me. I didn't say a word. I simply lifted my glass in a slow, deliberate motion, took a sip, and smiled. Her face drained of color. She leaned toward me, voice low, urgent. "What did you do?" I tilted my head slightly. "Me?" Her jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me, this—" She gestured around the collapsing event, her voice frantic. "This is you, isn't it?" I let the silence stretch between us. Then, in the calmest voice possible, I said, "Oh, sweetheart, I'm just sitting in the back like you all wanted." And with that, I set my glass down, leaned back and watched as everything fell apart. The double doors at the far end of the venue burst open. One by one, the last remaining staff members, security guards, dishwashers, event coordinators, filed, out in a perfectly coordinated exodus. Guests stood up bewildered. The once grand wedding, the pinnacle of my in-laws' wealth and status, was collapsing before their eyes. A cold chill settled over the room. People pulled out their phones, making calls, whispering frantically. But I already knew. There was no one coming to fix this. This wasn't just a wedding disaster. This was a reckoning, and my wife's family was about to learn exactly who I was. I checked my watch. Time for the truth. It started, slowly, a ripple of confusion rolling through the ballroom. Then, like a glass shattering in slow motion, the event began to fall apart. At the buffet table, a well-dressed guest lifted the silver lid of a serving tray, only to find it completely empty. Not half full, not poorly stocked, completely empty. His face twisted in confusion. He slammed the lid shut and spun toward a nearby waiter. "What is this?" He gestured wildly at the barren table. The waiter, a composed older man, reached into his pocket, pulled out a resignation slip, and placed it carefully on the table. Then, he turned and walked away. A woman in a red silk gown let out a nervous laugh. "This has to be a joke, right? Where's the food?" No answer, because the kitchen staff was gone. The people responsible for preparing the entrees, ensuring glasses never emptied, keeping the illusion of endless luxury alive. They had now walked out. And now there was nothing left to serve. At the bar, a young woman in a diamond-studded dress tapped her fingers impatiently. "Hello? Can I get some champagne?" The bartender, the last one remaining, poured a single drink, set it down, and exhaled. Then with a slow, almost satisfied expression, he lifted his hands and said, "Sorry, folks, we're closed." Gasps, stunned silence. Then, "Closed? Are you insane? This is a wedding." The bartender shrugged. "Not my problem anymore." Then he turned on his heel and left. The guests stared at the abandoned bar, at the untouched bottles, at the emptiness surrounding them. Still, they tried to downplay it. It's just a miscommunication. They probably just had a shift, change. They'll be back. Then, the lights dimmed. Not dramatically. Not romantically. The chandeliers flickered. The spotlights around the bride and groom shut off. The soft glow that once made this event look like a scene from a fairy. Tale gone. Now the wedding looked cheap, dull, bare, and that's when people truly started leaving. Not in an orderly, polite manner. No. They slipped toward the exits quickly, quietly, as if they didn't want to be associated with this disaster. By now, my mother-in-law was trembling. Her perfectly sculpted face was cracked with horror. She grabbed the wedding coordinator by the arm, fingers digging into her skin. Get them back. The coordinator looked down at her clipboard. Then finally she spoke. Ma'am, they don't work for us. A silence fell over the room. My mother-in-law froze. She turned, slowly, mechanically, and locked eyes with me. And in that moment, she knew. She didn't know how I did it. She didn't know when I did it, but she knew it was me. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "You did this." I let a slow smile creep across my face. "I told you." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Told me what?" I leaned in slightly, my voice steady. "That disrespect has consequences." She sucked in a sharp breath. "But this is ruining my son's wedding." I exhaled, shaking my head. "No, sweetheart." I smirked. "I'm ruining your wedding." Her eyes widened in realization, and then the venue manager appeared at the entrance, her face grim, hands clasped together. She approached my mother-in-law cautiously, carefully, like one would approach a wounded predator. Then, in a professional, even voice, she delivered the final blow. "Ma'am, I regret to inform you that due to a breach of contract, this event is now being shut down." Gasps. Whispers. My mother-in-law staggered back, stunned into silence. The wedding was over, and I just watched it burn. The wedding had crumbled. No food, no drinks, no music, no staff. Just empty tables, spilled champagne, and the slow, sinking, shame of a family whose legacy was built on status and wealth, now reduced to nothing. At the center of it all stood my mother-in-law, rigid, shaking, her perfectly manicured hands trembling at her sides. For the first time in her life, she was powerless. The guests had already started leaving, their hushed whispers slicing through the thick air. What a disaster. I've never seen anything like this. The Vasquez family will never recover from this. One by one, they abandoned the sinking ship, careful to distance themselves from the wreckage. I remained still, watching, waiting. And then, my wife, Valeria, she had spent the entire night ignoring me, dismissing me, pretending I didn't exist. But now, she was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. She turned slowly, almost mechanically, her breath unsteady, her voice soft, barely a whisper. "You did this." I said nothing. I just let the weight of her words hang between us. Then, finally, I spoke. "What makes you think that?" She took a shaky step toward me. "Because this," she gestured wildly at the ruined event, the fleeing guests, the devastation in her mother's eyes. "This is too perfect. It's planned, it's you." I tilted my head slightly. "Maybe." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Why?" she whispered. I leaned in, my voice calm, unshaken. "Because you let them disrespect me." Her breath hitched. "Because they called me the poor one and you laughed." Her hands clenched. "Because you made me an outsider at my own family's event." Her eyes widened. "But no," I cut her off, shaking my head. "No excuses." Tears welled up in her eyes. I didn't mean for—" "Didn't mean what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper. "Didn't mean for me to hear it? Didn't mean for me to finally do something about it?" Her breathing grew uneven. "Julian, you chose them over me." Her face crumpled. I exhaled deeply, adjusting my cufflinks. "And now you get to live with that choice." She reached for me, but I had nothing left to give. I turned my back and walked away. She gasped. "Wait! Julian, please!" Her heels clicked frantically against the marble floor as she ran after me. Not once did I stop. Not when I heard her choke back a sob. Not when she whispered my name like a prayer she already knew wouldn't be answered. I stepped outside into the cold night air, and for the first time in years, I smiled. I was free. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a specific number. Then I dialed. The voice on the other end answered instantly. "Is it done?" I took one. Last look at the venue behind me, at the scattered guests, the abandoned tables, the groom slumped in a chair, head in his hands, at my wife, standing alone, crying. I exhaled. Yeah. I turned away for good. It's done. Click. I walked to my car, never looking back. 1 year later, I vanished from their world. No shared bank accounts. No mutual friends. No trace of me left behind. My house. Sold. My name. Whispered in rumors. Whatever happened to him? He just disappeared. I heard he moved overseas. Only one person knew the truth. Her. And exactly 1 year after that ruined wedding, she saw me again. A high-end restaurant, a private table. A beautiful woman sitting across from me, laughing. I didn't see Valeria at first, but she saw me. For a moment, just a moment, our eyes met. Her face fell, because in that single second, she realized what she had thrown away. Not a poor man, not an unworthy husband, but a man who had rebuilt his life without her. I lifted my glass in a silent toast. Then, I looked away. Because she was nothing more than a memory now, and me, I was finally living. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.